Hi, good afternoon. This is Bjorn Markeson with IMPLAN, and we are going to get started here in about 2 minutes as folks filter in. So I'll just go on mute here for a couple minutes and then we'll get started. All right, let's get started. So today's webinar is exploring regional supply chains, value chains, and tariff impacts with IMPLAN. I'm Bjorn Markeson. I'm the Academic Divisional Director and an economist here at IMPLAN. I'll be hosting today's webinar. A couple things before we get started. We like to keep our webinars interactive by allowing attendees to pose questions to presenters. What we're going to do today is we are going to enter that into the question box, and we may have time for live questions at the end, but we're going to use the question box going forward. My colleague Candy Klaus is on the call as well and will be helping assist with some of those questions. So what are we going to be going over today? Well, first of all, what are regional supply and value chains and how they differ from one another? Then we'll assess how these chains are valuable in really understanding how different parts of a regional economy interact in light of recent and ongoing changes to tariff policy. All of this will be used to extend our focus to underlying IMPLAN data sets. And then finally, we'll go over some use cases and actually walk through some slides showing how to examine regional supply chains and value chains in IMPLAN. So the first thing we're going to look at is an introduction to supply chains and value chains. Disruptions in global supply chains have become increasingly frequent and visible to both producers and consumers due to various policy choices. In this webinar, we're going to look at local supply chains and learn what they are and how they differ from value chains, and then demonstrate how to analyze regional supply chains and value chains in IMPLAN. We're going to dig into the data underlying IMPLAN's input-output model to gain additional understanding to the aspects of a supply chain that affect regional economic impacts, and then explore regional value chains to better understand the impacts of product distribution and sale. And this is all going to be done in light of changes to tariff policies. So when we're looking at a local supply chain, what are we talking about when we're talking about a supply chain? It follows the changes in form of a good or commodity. That is, it involves an act of transformation. changing from one state to another. So we can think of this when we're looking at a supply chain for bread, right? Wheat goes to the mill where it is transformed into flour. It is then transported to a bakery where it is transformed into bread. There's a lot of process associated with this, but each of these nodes could also be expanded to a different supply chain, right? So there are multiple supply chains that feed the production of bread. We could think about it as, in another sense, the supply chain that extends back into iron ore. Iron ore goes to a steel mill, is used to then manufacture baking equipment, which then is used in the production of bread. So any final good has a number of different supply chains or branches to the supply chain that feed into its production. So here's an agricultural supply chain. We can think of a more manufacturing-based supply chain. Iron ore is transported to a steel mill where it is transformed into steel and is shipped to an auto plant and transformed into a car, right? This is a simplified process, but just to give a better idea of what that supply chain means. It also applies to knowledge economy applications as well, such as R&D and design, right? Knowledge is a part of a supply chain. So knowledge or research techniques are brought to a lab in which they are an input into and transformed into a design for a semiconductor. That semiconductor design goes to the semiconductor plant where it is transformed into an actual semiconductor, which then transformed to an auto plant, which is then assembled into a car. And so when we're thinking about a supply chain, in some sense, it reaches back, and especially when we're thinking about industrial level supply chains as we are in IMPLAN, we're not looking at individual firms, we're looking at supply chains of an industry. It's reaching back to those raw materials, whether those raw materials are grown like wheat or extracted like iron ore, or based in some sort of knowledge structure, right? That's what we're thinking about when we're thinking about a supply chain. We've seen a lot of disruptions in supply chains recently. They've been in the news, so I do feel like I should touch on them briefly. And there's three key causes of supply chain disruptions that we're going to use to inform our discussion today. The first are transportation disruptions, and these can occur due to weather events, disasters, conflict, disease, right? So we all remember the shortages that existed early in or through the beginning of the COVID crisis, in which the pandemic, in which we saw shortages due to transportation shutdowns. Transportation shut down, therefore goods that were coming from outside of a particular region did not did not move through that supply chain, and there were bottlenecks in it. Also, natural disasters cause these types of problems. Conflicts, right? So at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war, we saw shortages of wheat on the global market associated with that conflict. Also, we see that again often in the Persian Gulf when there are flare-ups in terms of oil disruptions. So transportation disruptions can disrupt supply chains, but then also kind of economic shocks themselves. So negative supply shocks. So both physical inputs in labor, that is, a firm is less able to acquire inputs needed for production. This is one place where tariffs come in, right? So they are a tax on imports, and suppliers are willing to supply less of a good at a given price, creating a negative supply shock on imported components, right? So you're less likely to receive a given quantity of an input due to suppliers being unwilling to sell that amount at a given price. We also see positive demand shocks, right? So there's two sides to this. We're going to get to this in a second. but positive demand shocks, surges in demand for a particular product, may disrupt the supply of a different good due to sharing a link on the supply chain. So this is another place where tariffs come in, since they are a tax on imports, creating a positive supply shock on domestic components, right? So if something I was receiving from as an import, from a foreign import from outside of the country, now due to tariff structures is more expensive than a domestic component, my demand for that domestic component goes up. And this is a positive demand shock. It can disrupt the supply chain in the sense that others may have already been using that domestic production, and it disrupts that supply. So when we're thinking about tariffs and how tariffs affect supply chains, or how they can affect supply chains, there's a number of different costs associated with them. The one we're going to key in on today and use to kind of illuminate what we're looking at in IMPLAN are adjustment costs. So adjustment costs are the costs of adjusting production processes or locations to account for new prices. That is, decreasing output or onshoring production, right? So an input you're using goes up in price. You have a number of options. Two key ones are decreasing your output, because you're now going to be likely using less of that input at a given price. The degree to which you decrease output is related to how much you're willing to pass prices on to consumers. Or onshoring production, that is, bringing production of a particular good into the domestic market. So the key to this is the stability of the tariff regime. That is, if expectations are that it is temporary or it's likely to fluctuate unpredictably, we often see firms looking to decrease output, right? You're going to pass those costs onto the firm, onto consumers. You're going to produce less of a good due to being unclear as to what the tariff regime's length is going to be. If expectations are for stability, that is, you expect these tariffs to remain in place for an extended period of time, to remain at a given level, to not be increasing or decreasing arbitrarily, then you would expect to see more onshoring of production, right? So if part of my production supplies are coming from overseas, those are heavily tariffed, and I expect those tariffs to remain in place at a stable level for a long period of time, I would like to try to bring those that production onshore. That being said, some things just can't be onshored, right? So coffee production, for one, right? If you're looking at the US market, coffee production in the US is not particularly feasible, and this will lead to increased costs and decreased usage, right? So you're not going to onshore production of particular items because they can't be. Both of these types of adjustment costs can be modeled in IMPLAN, and we'll highlight them when they're in the tool. But just kind of a preview, right? We can think about shocks to commodity demand or industry output as a part of those decreasing in output, and then onshoring production, thinking about that in terms of modeling new facilities in a particular region. So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about value chains. That was supply chains. It's an act of transformation. But just so we don't get confused, we're going to go through what a value chain is for purposes of our discussion. Value chains are described and defined differently in various disciplines. Here's how we're going to talk about value chains. We're talking about them as it follows the change in value as a good moves from producer to consumers. That is, it involves an act of transportation. So each step of the value chain, the seller receives a markup or margin of the original price as their profit, right? So the producer produces a good, transports it to the wholesaler. They then transport it to a retailer, who then sell it and transport it to an end user. The sum of these margins is 1. That is, they are a percentage of the final price. So in this case, we're seeing three separate margins: producer margins, wholesaler margins, and retailer margins. So where do these margins come from in IMPLAN? We source them in a number of particular cases. We use BEA benchmark IO tables for producer values and transportation margins. We use the Census Bureau's annual survey of retail trade for retail margins, and then the Census Bureau's annual report for wholesale trade for those wholesale margins. So we are sourcing these data in both BEA and Census Bureau data sets. One thing to note is that the producer margin, for example, is the percent of the consumer price received by producers and does not directly transmit information about the markup received by producers over their total input costs, right? So if we're saying that a producer margin is 50%, that means 50% of the end user's cost of the final retail price is going to that producer. A higher producer margin can indicate a number of things. It could indicate that input costs are a high percentage of the purchaser price, or it could be indicative of market power that allows producers to retain a larger portion of the price for themselves. So looking at that margin as an indicator of some other type of market power is not there in that data. Okay. So now we've separated our understanding of supply chains and value chains, or take a little bit of a look at regional supply chains. So input-output analysis is a way of calculating the effects of a change or shock to the economy along that industrial supply chain. Going back to our standard input-output assumptions, it assumes a stable supply chain is able to absorb or respond to changes in demand created by the shock in question. So we're looking at how shocks ripple through a supply chain, and in IMPLAN, we've regionalized that supply chain by industry, so we can look at how shocks in one part of the United States ripple through and affect other parts of the country. Looking at a particular supply chain allows for a deeper understanding of why impacts accrue to specific industries. So these pathways and impacted sectors are easy to view in IMPLAN. We can think of this in terms of direct and induced. In terms of direct, regional supply chains supply the direct effect event. And then in terms of induced, employment patterns in the supply chain and effect on induced effects. So analysis of a regional supply chain helps in understanding why multipliers vary by region. So the existence and richness of local supply chains and regional purchasing patterns in trade. Minor detour. One of the key ways in which we measure local purchasing is via a regional purchasing coefficient. These RPCs scale with the region of interest you're looking at. So if you're looking at an individual county, the RPC represents how much of an input is being sourced within the county itself. If you're looking at a national RPC, that measures that domestic supply. So a regional purchase coefficient is the proportion of the total demand for a commodity that's supplied by producers located within the study area. You can find these in IMPLAN. RPC values tell us how much of our commodity can be found locally, right? So if we're thinking about this in terms of local production and imports, or things that may or may not be affected by tariffs, we think about this in terms of three different steps, right? So there's local production, there is domestic imports. So if I'm in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, and I'm importing something for production from somewhere else in North Carolina or somewhere else in the United States, that is a domestic import. I'm importing it into Mecklenburg County from somewhere else in the United States. And then we have foreign imports. So those are coming from outside the national economy. So imports are considered a leakage in IMPLAN. So those dollars are not going to be used to create additional rounds of spending in industry events unless that process is MRIO'd to the exporting region, so multi-regional input-output. So using that MRIO capability allows you to track those dollars as they track through the domestic economy. And so this assesses local economies in terms of local verticality. Is there a rich local supply chain of related industries, or is everything being shipped in and out of the region? And if it's being shipped in and out of the region, is it being shipped in and out of the region from domestic or foreign imports? And then we're not going to really get into this today, but a lot of folks use that data to identify gaps in local supply chains as targets for local economic development, right? So if we're using a lot of component A in multiple industries in our region that are not being sourced from here, how can we think about bringing that supply chain into the region? So that's the supply chain analysis on the domestic front in a particular region. Let's shift this to value chains. What this is kind of outside of economic impact analysis. We're investigating industry level distribution of final sale price among parts of the value chain. We can understand the margin paid to various levels of distribution of a given good and understand how value shifts from producers to consumers and how producers, wholesalers, retailers, and transportation margins relate to one another. So in other words, how does that transportation affect the price of the overall good? So let's take a look at supply chains in IMPLAN. So again, input-output analysis is a way of calculating the effects of a change or shock to the economy along the supply chain. Going back to our standard input-output assumptions, it assumes a stable supply chain, as we mentioned. But we're going to follow that shock through the supply chain overall. So where we're going to look at this, even before running an economic impact, is to use that region details section of IMPLAN. So if you're in the regions section and we are looking at North Carolina here, I've looked at North Carolina as a whole, then there's the view region details button on the North Carolina card. I can click that, and then that brings me to a vast quantity of data that underlies the model, specific to the region of North Carolina. So most of the tables we're going to be looking at are in the social accounts tab, both balance sheets and reports. We're going to ignore the SAM for today, right? So reports and balance sheets are going to be where we're living in this discussion. The social accounting matrix is there, but we're not going to be working with that today. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at an industry balance sheet, right? So I screenshotted it here so it's easy to see the path of how I moved through the tool. Went to social accounts, balance sheets, industry balance sheets, commodity demand. And what this gets me is the region's industry commodity demand for a particular industry. So I've chosen pharmaceutical preparation manufacturing in North Carolina, and this has pulled up the commodity demand for that sector, right? We'll zoom in on the top 10. What this is giving me is a number of key pieces of information. I've sorted that table. All the tables in IMPLAN are sortable and extractable. You can see the 3 little dots in the upper right-hand corner here. You can click on that to download the table. What are the gross inputs into this sector, right? Wholesale services, drugs and drug sundries, large input, gross input value. That's the dollars spent in this region on that particular input in their production function. And then we also have that RPC, the regional purchase coefficient. What percentage of that input is produced within the region of interest. Again, here we're looking at North Carolina as a whole. I can look down closer into this in terms of individual counties as well, MSAs, custom aggregated regions. As you customize those aggregations, we rebuild all of these tables. So here I've started this to look at the largest intermediate inputs, and this gives a good idea of where those leakages are in the supply chain, right? So management is local, advertising is mostly local, truck transportation, banking are all local, but other major inputs such as biological products, medicines and botanicals, pharmaceuticals, and other basic organic chemicals are coming from outside the region. So what I want to know is, where are those coming from, right? So I want to know which of those may be subject to new import duties. So I can go to the commodity trade section. So again, social accounts, reports, commodity trade, and that gets me to the region's commodity trade table. So I'm zooming in. So two things to note. One is there are two tables here. There's imports and exports. Exports is on the top. You use the scroll bar here on the right to scroll down to get to the imports section. So let's look at those biological products, except diagnostic, right? So that commodity code 3166 is an IMPLAN code. It matches up with federal NAICS, with the NAICS code classification system. So what I'm looking at here is a table that pulls out two key pieces of information I want to point out. One is domestic imports of about, looks like $1 billion, and then foreign imports of about $2.7 billion. So what we're looking at is about $3.8 billion worth of goods are imported, some domestically, some foreign. And if we're looking at that foreign import proportion, we're looking at a very high proportion of biological products being imported from outside of the United States. So biological products are nearly 75%, 73% imported. And if we remember from the previous table, they're 14% of the intermediate goods cost of pharmaceutical manufacturing. So when we're thinking about how is the overall manufacturing process for pharmaceuticals in North Carolina going to be affected, well, we're going to think about it in terms of the degree to which biological products are affected. We can scroll through this table to see what types of goods of foreign import are mostly foreign imported in North Carolina. So in this case, surface active reagents, also highly imported, printing inks, highly imported. So now we have an idea of a little bit about what portions of that supply chain are going to be, that industrial supply chain are going to be affected by tariffs, or affected when the price of foreign goods goes up. Sorry. What we're looking at here is what does the pharma manufacturing produce, right? So we can look at what the industry produces by looking at the balance sheets, industry balance sheets, commodity production sector. And what that gets us is a better understanding of what that sector produces overall. Right, so we're going to now go to this piece. So commodity production, so it mostly produces pharmaceuticals, but other commodities as well. It produces some biological products, some medicines, botanicals, other basic organic chemicals, surgical supplies, so on and so forth. But this gives us an idea of what other types of goods are produced by the pharmaceutical manufacturing industry, and goods whose overall output are going to be affected by those particular shocks, effects, and tariffs. So the next question is, who uses pharmaceuticals produced in North Carolina, right? So if we're going to think about what, how are the dollar values of pharmaceuticals going to be affected by increased costs on their inputs, this is going to affect particular sectors, right? So we're going to look at balance sheets, commodity balance sheets, industry demand. Who demands pharmaceuticals, right? What are those industries that consume pharmaceutical goods produced by pharmaceutical preparation manufacturing? The sector itself, hospitals, biological product manufacturing, home health services, veterinary services, offices of physicians, right? So when we're thinking about how these dollars start to ripple through the economy, we can start to get an idea of how that is going to happen via these particular tables. We can also see how it is affects the global economy, right? So pharmaceuticals, we're looking at about 10% of those are foreign export, right? So this production will be produced in North Carolina. Some of it will be for domestic consumption, some of it will be for foreign consumption. And so we're looking at how much of what is being produced here will likely be affected by reciprocal tariffs that may be imposed on goods in terms of kind of going back and forth in terms of tariff effects. So let's do this. We can also look at who else produces pharmaceutical products, right? So what other sectors, and we can look at that here. One thing this might be useful in thinking about is the broad range of sectors that are affected by particular tariff productions. A lot of these will have similar input structures depending on what they're in. Okay. So, well, we want to kind of move to an example with an impact. What we want to look at is what a 2% contraction in the pharmaceutical preparation manufacturing industry in North Carolina would look like. This is, one of the key industrial consumers of biological products. So those biological products likely have a tariff on them. How is that going? Are imported, have a generalized tariff on them. So what we're going to do is we're going to run a 2% contraction in that industry using industry output, run it through the model. First cut is looking at this in terms of looking back through the supply chain. In other words, because production is down in a particular industry, what would we expect to see the overall effects of that being? Because not only are they going to use less of one particular input, they're going to use less of a large range of different inputs, right? So the way we think about the economy in an input-output model is in the short run, production functions are set and they are in fixed proportions, right? Leontief production functions. And so because we're decreasing our use of biological products, we're going to have to decrease overall production, which means we're going to decrease inputs in all kinds of other goods. That's captured in those indirect effects, right? So the supply chain effects, overall the business-to-business effects are going to ripple through the economy and drive additional losses in jobs and GDP. And then all through the supply chain, individuals are earning less labor income, which means they're going to spend less labor income. And that drives additional losses. So a 2% contraction in the pharmaceutical industry in North Carolina looks at, that's about 325 jobs directly. But overall, we're looking at about 1,200 jobs in North Carolina being affected or being touched by this particular contraction. And also taxes are going to be affected as well, right? Because there's less production, because there's less wages, we're thinking about this in terms of state, local, federal tax revenue will be diminished as well. So we look at the output tab, right? What other sectors in the supply chain are going to be affected? Wholesale drug trade, management of companies, banks, truck transportation, advertising, electric power, employment services, warehousing, right? These are going to ripple through the supply chain. And it's going to hit a lot of these harder because a lot of these are locally sourced, right? So high regional purchase coefficient inputs to a particular industry are going to have more magnified effects because you're going to have less leakage of those losses. In the same way that if it was a growth, you would have less leakage of the benefits. Here you're having less leakage of losses. And then we can think about this. So here's those industries that are being particularly affected in terms of indirect effects. We can also look at this in terms of jobs, right? There are going to be job effects throughout the supply chain. The relationship is not necessarily directly correlated between changes in output and changes in employment. And so we can look specifically at what sectors are going to be affected in terms of employment, management, wholesale, shipping, warehousing, employment services, truck transportation. That's those labor-intensive jobs where you're going to have larger employment shocks. Value chains.
Hey, Bjorn, while you're there real quick.
Yep.
Someone missed how you plugged in the 2%. Can you just pop back to that while we're here?
Sure. Yep. So this is one of the advantages of having this screenshotted is that I can hold on certain pieces. What I did here is I calculated what 2% of the industry production was from the first slide, from the first page of the regions details tab, and then I entered it as a negative value in this value piece.
And where did you get that 2%?
So that's where you had to bring something in from outside the model, right? So the question is what is the effect of a tariff? How is that going to affect your overall production? And so the initial shock, that first step, has to come from outside of the IMPLAN model. We do not have the model itself is not structured to measure how much of a shock that will be. That's externally generated. But then what IMPLAN does do is it follows it through all of the different kind of fingers of that supply chain to see how it reaches out into other parts of the economy and other regions in the country. Excellent question. So we're going to value chain. So there's two ways to approach value chains in IMPLAN. One is looking at the margins 528 spreadsheet, which is on our support site, support.implan.com. If you enter margins 528 spreadsheet, you'll be able to download that. That's an Excel spreadsheet. And then calculating commodity events with purchaser prices. We'll show you that here shortly. So that margins 528 spreadsheet has national level margins in 10 wholesale categories, 11 retail categories, and 5 transportation categories. So again, the values here represent the percentage of final purchaser prices accruing to each particular industry. So we're looking at this grain sector, right? So new sector, new structure. We're looking at a margin for each step along the way, right? So of this overall production, 50% of the consumer price goes to the grain production industry. About 16.5% goes to wholesale services. About 22% goes to retail services, food and beverage stores, and then the remainder goes to different types of air, rail, water, and truck transportation, right? So not a particularly sensitive good, so we're not looking at a lot of air transportation services, but plenty of rail, water, and truck transportation for these overall products, right? So a lot of that grain is going to be shipped by rail and barge, and then final goods shipped through truck transportation. Again, the values represent that final purchase, the percentage of the final purchaser price accruing to each particular industry. Again, these are shares of final good costs, not profit margins, right? So this isn't saying what the profit margin is for a particular sector, but what their margin is or what their percentage of that that final producer price, for the final consumer price is. One question is, kind of thinking about this, why is the price of something going up? And folks often say gas prices, but here we're looking at they're only 3.8%. Truck transportation is only 3.8% of the final price. Well, no, they're also in the transportation cost of all other inputs that affect those purchaser costs. So we're just looking at this ripples through the overall economy overall. So we can look at this in terms of a commodity output event. So we're going back to the pharmaceutical sector in North Carolina. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at a $10 million commodity output event. What happens for every $10 million of goods in the pharmaceutical industry? I'm going to look at this in terms of producer prices, and I'm going to use the SAM function. So again, here's how this ripples through, and then we can see those leakages, imports to region, institutional commodity sales, tax effects, all the way through that supply chain and the effects of that commodity good. And again, right, so for every $10 million, we're looking at about 2 individuals in employment in the direct, indirect, and induced, which in a high value industry such as pharmaceuticals makes sense. Like $10 million worth of pharmaceuticals is produced by a fairly dense number of individuals. What are the industries with direct impact output as a percentage of that total industry output? We're looking at pharmaceuticals, wholesale, druggists, biological production, medicinal and biological products, management, advertising. And that wraps up kind of the overall structure of what we were talking about today. Happy to take any questions. Candy, were there any that came in through the chat?
Yes, indeed.
Excellent.
Great one from Moses. How would we use IMPLAN to brainstorm mitigations to see how proposed forward plans might impact the business models? Also, would it be possible to automate this process so an AI could simulate a lot of new solutions?
I'll take the second point first. I would definitely talk with your customer success manager or your regional sales rep about API applications with IMPLAN. When you're talking about looking at automated solutions or translating the solutions, the data and modeling capabilities in the IMPLAN into a more automated process, that's the first step you're going to do. You're going to have that conversation with those folks. Candy, what was the first part of the question again?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me scroll up.
How do you brainstorm?
Brainstorm mitigations to see how proposed forward plans might impact the business models.
Yeah, so that's one thing that we can think about is looking at other similar industries that produce a particular product, right? So that might be one way of thinking about it. Another might be thinking about looking at inputs that have high import factors that are highly imported and trying to see if there are ways to source those inputs in a different way, right? So maybe steel is particularly tariffed, but a secondary good that is, if we're thinking about the bakery sector, right? So maybe steel is being tariffed at a high rate, and therefore U.S. producers of bakery equipment are paying a high price. Sourcing that outside of the region may be more effective because it obviates that steel tariff. But again, what we're looking at are kind of trying to iterate through the data to see where those weak points are, to help understand where do we have to think about mitigation effects being applied. Candy, anything you wanted to add to that?
Nope, I think you got it. Next question. I understand the 2% contraction assumption used, but what value do you enter for the industry? Is it the production reduced by 2% coming from the regional tables?
Yeah, that's exactly what I would use. And you can adjust that in a number of different ways, right? You can think about that in terms of a shift in dollars. You can think about it as, we're going to have to hire fewer people. We don't know the exact dollar amount, but we're going to shift down production. This could be a number of individuals, and you can use an employment number on that. But yeah, that's right.
Great. All right, for modeling the supply chain for knowledge, could IMPLAN be used to estimate the impact of AI on an industry?
I just saw we're kind of at the leading edge of some of these topics, right? So a lot of the data and the production tables that we use are coming from the BEA, and it takes them some time to do this survey work. So really kind of cutting edge industries, you have to do a lot more work internal to IMPLAN to model that. I did just see a report that looked at the economic impact of an AI facility in New York that used IMPLAN to measure that. What that was measuring was less of the impact of what AI does going forward, and more about the impacts of the AI facility in its supply chain. Remember, so IMPLAN, as it stands today, it looks at backward linkages. So looking at from the production of a particular good, right? So we stand up an AI tool. What are all of the inputs that go into that AI tool, and what are those effects through the economy? What it's not looking at is what are the effects of the downstream effects of that, or the forward linkages. And so if you're thinking about, oh, what happens with the use of AI, then you have to come at it with, again, another assumption of what is that first order effect? Is it increasing the productivity of existing facilities? Is it obviating the need for the existence of those facilities? And then how does that ripple effect hit the economy?
Thank you so much. All right, next question. For large-scale investment that involves constructing a new facility to produce new goods and then converting it into a secondary product, like investment for feedstock production, ethanol processing, and ethanol production, it affects various industries along the value chain. How should we model the impact on these various industries along the value chain?
Ooh, that's a good one. Candy, do you want to take a first stab at that one?
Yeah, so when we're looking at the operations of a new facility, first of all, the construction is going to look just like any other construction, whether we're building a manufacturing for something like ethanol or maybe new automotive plant. When we have that up and running, we have the operations, and the operations, when run through IMPLAN, is going to look at all of the supply chain that is affected through the production of whatever industry is in that space. If we want to look along the value chain, we can look at the backward linkage from the point of sale to see how those margins are affecting what is transported from the factory floor as it makes its way to the shelves at your local store. And I'll go ahead and take the next one too, Bjorn. Are there any industries that do not fall under a set NAICS, such as food banks or regional state fairs? The fun part about NAICS is they cover everything. So there's a NAICS code for everything that you wanted, even as specific as state fairs and food banks, which would food banks probably falling under some kind of community service, and state fairs maybe falling under government, but there's definitely a place where those will show up in the model. If you ever have any questions about what it would look like, you can search inside the application by keyword for the NAICS, or you can always reach out to IMPLAN, support@implan.com, and we can help you pick the right industry for what you want to look at. All right, next question. Can supply chain impacts be modeled alongside economic impact analysis? The goal would be to try to model an economic investment while accounting for potential tariff impacts.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the key things we're trying to do here is look at the economic impact of a particular industry, right? So one way of thinking about that is doing an industry contribution analysis for an existing industry, and then highlighting the degree to which inputs to that industry are foreign sourced or subject to tariffs, and looking at that production function for that industry, and then matching that up with whatever the current list of tariff goods is, and then that's kind of that second step, right? So looking at this industry is important, right? The pharmaceutical industry is important to the economy of North Carolina, and additionally, here is how it's going to be affected through the supply chain. We are going to be hit by tariffs on X, Y, and Z key imports that we are going to either have to try and find a way to source domestically or pass those costs onto consumers. So yeah, definitely a two-step process there.
Awesome. All right, how can we relate commodity demand to specific industry sectors? For example, if we wanted to characterize demand for specific commodities by sector. You want me to take that one, Bjorn?
That would be great.
Awesome. The easiest way to do this is going to be inside the IMPLAN application using an industry impact analysis detailed event type. Within that, looking at an industry, you can open up their spending on intermediate inputs and change anything that you would like to about the spending pattern of the specific firm or industry that you're looking at. And because of this, you can not only change what industry is in commodity, what commodities, pardon me, that industry is purchasing, you can also change how much of that spending on intermediate inputs is going to each of those commodity purchases. So that's the best way to do it inside the application, right inside that detailed event type. All right. Bjorn, I'll let you have this one. Can IMPLAN be used
All
to
right.
calculate GDP?
Absolutely. Yes. So what IMPLAN is doing, going back through here, let me get back on the screen. Whenever you're looking at an impact, we'll go to the supply chain impacts. When you're looking at these value added numbers, so economic indicators by impact, value added, that's going to be the number that's equivalent to the contribution to GDP, right? So a $400 million contraction in the pharmaceutical industry in North Carolina shrinks the overall GDP. So $400 million in output affects it by about $300 million in value added. So absolutely.
Wonderful. Okay, I understand that the industry output models are linear. That's correct. So a 2% contraction would reduce jobs and their taxes and other indicators by 2%, or would that vary?
So it's going to affect the inputs of each piece by 2%, right? So, but 2% of a larger amount, right? So think of it this way: a 2% effect on. Slow down, take a step back. A 2% contraction in North Carolina is going to have different ripple effects than a 2% contraction in Texas, a 2% contraction in Massachusetts, because those regional purchase coefficients vary from region to region. So the degree to which a particular county or particular state is able to source, or an industry in a particular county or particular state can source those inputs, varies, right? So you're bumping that 2% shock up against what percentage of those inputs are locally available. And so that second stage is going to vary by region. But yes, that steps through 2% at the first step, but then every iterative step after that, it deviates.
Thank you. All right, a follow-up to answer about the industry across the value chain. We have to model them separately, assuming industries impacted by each step on the value chain, right? Does that need a separate project per industry, or can one project accommodate all industries impacted along the value chain? So it all depends on what you want to look at. inside of IMPLAN. If we are looking across the entirety of the value chain, we can do that within one event in IMPLAN. And that's a little different than what Bjorn showed you today, but that's definitely possible. And we have information on everyone's favorite website, support.implan.com, on how best to model that as well. So generally what Bjorn showed you was looking at the supply chain, but if we want to look at the value chain, again, those margins associated with it, we would just come at it from a different way.
Excellent.
All right, Bjorn, I'll let you have this. For Canadian
All right.
users, are there any major
Mhm.
differences we should be aware of related to today's presentation?
Um, did not double check the Canadian model just beforehand. I would ask your sales or consumer customer service rep. That being said, currently we're looking at Canadian data at the national and provincial level. We are on the cusp of completing sub-provincial data for Canadian data, so keep that in mind as well. So while we can't currently go below the provincial level, that is something we are actively working on.
All right, I think we have answered everything either in the chat or live here on the webinar.
Excellent.
If anyone has a final question, please let me know. But other than that, thank you so much, Bjorn, for this presentation.
Thanks, Candy, for all your help.
Absolutely. And everyone have a fantastic afternoon.